Hello and welcome to Since Attlee Churchill, the podcast about British political history since the Second World War. I'm Lee Evans, a historian of the Conservative Party.
And I'm Richard Johnson, historian of the Labour Party, and Lee's husband. In each midweek episode, we will be marvelling over glorious pearls of contemporary British political interest.
This episode is a follow-up to our last Sunday episode, in which we looked at the history of Prime Minister's questions, from William Gladstone, when it first really became its own separate phenomenon from questioning ministers, through the premierships of Winston Churchill, Harold Macmillan, Jim Callaghan and Margaret Thatcher, and then most recently where a lot of changes came with Tony Blair. If you've not yet listened to that, I'd recommend that being quite a good place to start. But for this episode, we're going to reflect a little bit on what's Prime Minister's questions, or PMQs as it's generally known, like today. What's the point of it? Whose interest does it serve? Is it a good way to try and hold the Prime Minister to account? And how useful is it for members of Parliament as well? So, Richard, to kick us off, why don't we begin by thinking about what is the point of PMQs for members of Parliament, in particular backbench members of Parliament, for whom it is really one of the very rare occasions when they get the chance to get some headlines or at least get seen by the journalists, members of the public who may be tuning in?
I think there are maybe half a dozen different ways that members of Parliament use Prime Minister's questions in terms of the motives for their questioning. The first I can think of is the planted question. These are the questions that are effectively written by the leader's office or the party whips. They're given to MPs who have been successful in the shuffle, that ballot we talked about in our Sunday episode. And then they are an opportunity for delivering a soft question to the Prime Minister if you are on the Prime Minister's side, or a question that's helpful for the leader of the opposition if you're on the other side. And these questions often will take the format of something like, I'm exaggerating a little bit, but will the Prime Minister agree that this is the most wonderful government ever that's delivered 500,000 new houses for the most deserving people in the country, has delivered 10% growth, and has ended global warming? And does the Prime Minister agree that the previous government under the opposition party was the most wicked and evil government ever, that threw little children into cages and killed puppies and led to an economic depression?
I mean, you say that's an exaggeration. It's not much of an exaggeration, really. I mean, these are the questions which I think for PMQ's watchers really grind their gears because they look like somebody is just sucking up to the leadership.
And you might wonder, why would an MP debase themselves in such a way? It is so blatantly obvious to many of the people who watch PMQs, but it's seen as a way of demonstrating your loyalty to the leadership, getting yourself noticed by the leadership. And I suppose if you're going to be a minister, which is ultimately what these people are aspiring to be, then you have to show that you're willing to forward the party line, the government line of the day, even if it's a bit embarrassing and difficult perhaps to do so. And I think that's what part of that planted question practice is all about.
I think the other thing that it does, but this requires a particular context, is it can help a party which has a very clear message try and get that message out there at really the biggest parliamentary event of the week. So I think the last time that was probably done quite well was in the lead up to the 2015 general election, where quite clearly the message went out among Conservative MPs that they should try and drop the words long-term economic plan into as many questions as they could to the Prime Minister. And that was the centrepiece of the Conservative offering going into the 2015 election. Now, very much to Cameron and Osborne's credit, and also I think Linton Crosby's credit as well, who was leading that Conservative campaign, they knew that that message brought together quite a lot of the things that people already thought about the Conservatives in office. They knew that it had an appeal to a certain set of voters that they really needed to try and win over if they were to turn that coalition into a Conservative majority. And they were quite disciplined about doing it. And they want to make sure that that is being heard as often as possible. The other reason why I mentioned that particular example is that because these questions can be so cringy, when it's obvious that the Member of Parliament has not written them themselves, they've been given to them by whips or the Prime Minister's PPS or whoever. To make it work, you kind of have to deliver it with a bit of a knowing look, a bit of a twinkle in your eye that you're playing a game here that's not just sycophancy, but is serving a bit of a political objective. So around this time, when a Conservative MP would drop in the long-term economic plan, there'd be a bit of a groan in some parts of the Commons, a bit of a cheer in other parts, because it was such an obvious point. But actually, the way David Cameron would sometimes do it, he would leave a bit of a pause before saying long-term economic plan to riff on the fact that people knew what was coming in his response to the question. And I think sometimes having that knowing sense that you're doing a planted question is actually what can make you pull it off with some credibility, rather than it looking like you're the sort of person who will just say whatever they're told to say, because that's what the party higher-ups want.
Well, that bleeds a little bit into my second type of PMQs question, which is the blatantly partisan party political question, which may not be planted, right? So it may be that an MP wishes to make an attack on the opposition or on the government and does so under their own initiative. It will be helpful to their party leader by transitive property, but the whips haven't written those questions. And why might an MP do that? Well, one is that MPs are partisans and they're elected under party labels and they want to help their own side and to tear down the other side. But I think it might also be, I know what your thoughts are on this, Lee, it might also be a way for an MP to catch the eye of the leadership. And maybe it's a bit more oppressive if an MP writes their own partisan question rather than simply relying on the whips. I think it's doing a slightly different thing. Reading the questions from the whips is a way of demonstrating your papabile, your status as minister, of being potentially someone who could front a government line as a minister. And this is trying to demonstrate your initiative, which is not always a bad thing for a minister, I have to say, although I think sometimes in today's politics, it's looked down upon a bit more than it should be. And I think this is particularly pertinent maybe for the opposition. So when you think about having shadow cabinet ministers, you want people who are good spokespeople who can go on the attack against the governing party of the day. And let's say there's a backbench Conservative MP, a new Conservative MP, there are a few, I think, who want to end up in the shadow cabinet. Well, maybe asking a pretty punchy question at PMQs to take down the Labour Party and Keir Starmer might get you noticed by Kemi Badenoch and might help in your path of elevation into the shadow cabinet.
I think that's right. The other thing I guess it can do as well is it can try and make your pitch within a partisan fight that is particularly relevant to your own constituency. So it can quite often be the case, for example, that devolved areas of policy are not scrutinised at Prime Minister's questions because they are not ultimately the responsibility of the government in Westminster. For example, healthcare in Wales or transport policy in Scotland. But if you are, say, a Scottish Labour MP, then your fight is probably most obviously with the Scottish National Party up in Scotland. And so what it might be is that you want to try and use the platform of Prime Minister's questions to drop in an attack line against the SNP, which isn't necessarily something that Keir Starmer is going to do because he's looking at a more Westminster-based fight where since their dramatic change of fortunes in 2024, the SNP are slightly less relevant. So I guess that's the other reason why you might write your own partisan attack to try and reflect the political makeup of your own constituency and the battles and challenges that you face.
And that, I think, leads nicely on to my third category of PMQ's question, which is the parochial question. This is the question about an MP's constituency. I might rather flippantly put this as a question in the form of, will the Prime Minister acknowledge the existence of my constituency? So this is when an MP stands up and says, in Bedford, we are proud of our embankment area, which has been newly done up thanks to a fund by the Labour government. Will the Prime Minister congratulate the council workers who have worked so much on tidying the embankment area around the River Ouse in Bedford? And then the Prime Minister might say, I congratulate my honourable friend, the MP for Bedford, on his work in securing a grant for his constituents, and how this wonderful facelift of the embankment in Bedford will lead to tourism and happiness and wonders for the great people of Bedford, etc., etc., etc. I say Bedford because that was my hometown. It's not very interesting to most of the people in the chamber. In fact, it may not be of interest to 649 out of the 650 members in the chamber. So why might you do this? For one, it brings attention to your local area. And back in the day when local newspapers were an important form of media consumption, this could be a way to get a story in your local newspaper. You might get some coverage on the Bedfordshire on Sunday or the Bedfordshire Times and Citizen, the two local newspapers I can remember. But as local newspapers have more or less died out, or certainly are a shadow of their former self, that I think is less important than it once was. But what has replaced that is the clipping of the question for social media. I think this is a regrettable development in our parliament, where MPs increasingly are making interventions for the social media likes and clicks and hits, rather than actually thinking about the role of what they're saying for the debate in the chamber. But it may be just an inescapable part of our politics, and I'm not sure there's really much that can be done about it. But I do think that now is what you will see quite a good chunk of MPs doing in Prime Minister's questions, is asking a question so that they can put it on their Facebook page and put it on TikTok, and get social media engagement for it.
Yes, in fact, I would go as far as to say that that's probably the majority of questions now that are put by backbench MPs are meant for social media clipping. I don't blame them for that. In many respects, you would be negligent as a member of parliament if you weren't clipping your parliamentary contributions. For me, though, there's two issues going on there. One of them is, are you trying to tell your constituents that you're actually an outstanding member of parliament who is working in the national interest? And therefore that there are issues that, yes, are relevant to the constituency, but there are also national issues that you're across and on top of. And in my view, very few MPs really try and do that. Much more common is the option you've described, Richard, of trying to focus on something quite parochial. My issue with the way those questions tend to be framed is that they're very often like the hypothetical example that you gave. Will the Prime Minister congratulate so-and-so? Or will he acknowledge the amazing work of so-and-so? And that might be perfectly normal, but actually, write to number 10 and ask them to send a letter to somebody congratulating them. I don't really think that that is what constituents look for MPs to do if they're raising local issues in the chamber, the House of Commons. Much better, I think, and to be fair, some of the Liberal Democrat MPs have been quite good at doing this, particularly those who are in parts of the southeast affected by the southeastern water problems recently. Much better to stand up and actually say, here is a major problem in my constituency and I want the government's attention on it. Because then what you're doing is not just trying to give the Prime Minister a soft soap question, which is of some local relevance. You're then actually trying to speak up and demand action for your local area at the highest level.
Sometimes MPs try to tie the constituency dimension in with a policy dimension, and that's the next category question one would ask, is perhaps what people might think is the most straightforward type of question in Prime Minister's questions, which is to get the Prime Minister to defend, explain, or confirm a policy position of the government. Thinking of that kind of hybrid of the constituency issue and the policy issue, I can remember several years ago now, when I lived in Lancaster, the pub at the end of my road, was called the Britannia Pub, closed down. And I was a little miffed about this because I used to go to that pub quite a lot. I used to sort of treat it as my front room, really. And my MP at the time, Cat Smith, who's still the MP for Lancaster, asked a question of Boris Johnson, the Prime Minister, in Prime Minister's Questions about the Britannia pub, which she name-checked. And I think the question then was tied in with government policies about preventing community assets from becoming housing or something like that. I don't want to say it was exactly on that, but it was tying the closure of this pub with the government's policies relating to commercial versus residential properties and community assets and things like that. And so I was watching this, and you have this, and I'm sure I watched it on her Facebook page. She must have clipped it and put it on her Facebook page, of Boris Johnson commenting about the closure of the pub that was about 3 doors down from my house in Lancaster. It was quite an extraordinary thing. And I guess that was a way that, I suppose that showed, already I was a supporter of Cat, so she didn't need to win my vote. Or I suppose what it does do is it wakes up a constituent who maybe isn't following politics very much, but they might share and say, have you seen that Boris Johnson was going on about the Britannia pub in Prime Minister's Questions?
Yes, lots of the questions that we've spoken about, of course, it varies depending upon whether or not you're a government MP or an opposition MP. And as we spoke about in our Sunday episode, all of these questions are supplementaries, and they're supplementaries to an open and generic question about the Prime Minister's engagements. So the Prime Minister will not know any of the questions unless they are either provided to the MPs by his own team or the MPs provide them to the Prime Minister's team in advance. Typically, government MPs do provide the Prime Minister with their questions or read one out that they're given in advance, but opposition MPs don't. That is one of the cases, or examples like that are arguably some of the cases where you would want to give the Prime Minister, even if you're an opposition MP, the question in advance, because if you're Cat Smith, if part of what you want to do is to have Boris Johnson stand up in the House of Commons and speak about a pub that has closed in Lancaster, 200 odd miles away, to try and show that you can get the government's attention on your seat, then there's something quite useful about making sure that the Prime Minister has got that written down in front of him, not least because it's obviously quite loud, it's quite rowdy, the acoustics are questionable at times in the House of Commons. And so it may be that he doesn't necessarily hear it and that the whole thing doesn't necessarily work. So if your point is to get something clippable that shows that the Prime Minister has been made aware of something happening in your patch, then in many ways you probably want to collaborate on that a little bit more.
So far we've gone through 4 different categories of question, all beginning with P: planted, parochial, policy, partisan. A 5th P, I might add, is a personal question. These, I think, are pretty rare, but these are the types of questions where an MP might use Prime Minister's Questions to make some kind of personal statement about themselves. I think these actually happen more often in more substantive debates in the House of Commons. So if there's a debate regarding, let's say, substance abuse, and an MP reveals that they're a recovering alcoholic or something like that, you sometimes see those kind of interventions. But of course, if you really want to make a splash and you really want to reveal something about yourself or make some kind of claim that is borderline between political and personal, then Prime Minister's Questions could be a moment to do that. And the 6th and final P that I have is the populist or the people's PMQs question. And actually, I'm thinking here not of Nigel Farage, but I'm thinking of Jeremy Corbyn. Because when Jeremy Corbyn was Prime Minister...
Thank God he wasn't.
Because when Jeremy Corbyn was leader of the opposition, he used to crowdsource his questions for Prime Minister's Questions, or at least he did for a time, where he would send out an email to Labour members and the public, I think more broadly, and ask them to submit questions for him to ask David Cameron, and then Theresa May, and then Boris Johnson. And sometimes you have MPs beyond the Leader of the Opposition, who will say, Mrs. Muggeridge down the road has a problem with her sewage, and she has got these awful pipes that have backed up and have created a horrible smell in her house. What is the Prime Minister going to do, and what will she say to Mrs. Muggeridge? And I think this is something that particularly I've noticed Ed Davey, the Lib Dem leader, likes to do these types of things, but other MPs will sometimes do it. Well, they will mention a specific individual in their constituency and basically ask a question on behalf of that individual.
It's quite a cheap tactic, but it can be quite effective, I think, partly because it makes it look like you are listening to real people. But also, maybe this is its biggest benefit for the questioner, is that it makes it impossible for the Prime Minister to mock the question. Because it's no longer a question that's being asked by a party political leader. It's now a question that's being asked earnestly by some hard-done-to member of the public. And so it, in some ways, takes the Punch and Judy nature of Prime Minister's questions out of it and makes it rather more somber, because the Prime Minister doesn't want to be seen to be mocking a member of the public, and their backbench MPs, who are often quite loud and rowdy, of course, no clapping in the chamber, but lots of jeering and cheering and all the rest of it, don't want to be seen to jeer a member of the public who's got a question. So that's its usefulness for MPs, particularly backbench MPs, and how they might use their questions. We want to come on now to look at the party leaders themselves. So this is rather less systematic, but I think there are a few things that we can say about the role of Prime Minister's questions for party leaders themselves. The first thing is to say that for the Prime Minister, it is a tremendous burden. It takes up a big chunk of their week preparing for this. All Prime Ministers say they get very nervous beforehand. Even those who come across as the most confident of all, people like Tony Blair, talk about how it was the most nerve-wracking, discombobulating, nail-biting, bowel-moving, terror-inspiring, courage-draining experience that he had as Prime Minister for 10 years. So none of them particularly enjoy it, but it does give them an opportunity. One, it gives them an opportunity to be heard by parts of the wider public, because it is the most watched parliamentary event of the week. But more than that, it gives them the chance to be able to show that they can answer a tough question, build an argument, defend an argument. Really things that political leadership has been about for centuries, millennia. Prime Minister's questions is a forum in which they can do that. And therefore it feeds in to a wider sense of how is this person doing as party leader. For example, one of the things that I actually think is helping Keir Starmer to some degree maintain his role is that he has not actually lost authority really in Prime Minister's questions. I don't think he's very good at answering the questions. I think he's often quite plodding and quite wooden. It's not a fun watch hearing Keir Starmer answer PMQs, but he's not had moments like Liz Truss did, for example, in her highly combustible, chaotic time as Prime Minister, in which it's just looked like he's lost control. Think of something like that moment where she leaned over the dispatch box and said, "I am a fighter and not a quitter." It was such an easily and highly mocked moment, and she resigned the next day. Now, I'm not saying that's the exact reason why, but Starmer has been able to maintain authority at the dispatch box, and I think that has helped him, even though backbench Labour MPs are not happy with the government's agenda, don't think it's performing well, don't think it's communicating well. The one moment in the week when they see their leader, he does reasonably well. It's also been a big factor in terms of the improving perception of Kemi Badenoch as leader of the Conservative Party. She is doing increasingly well at Prime Minister's questions. And then that filters out among MPs, a little bit among journalists, and a little bit among party members and the wider electorate as well. And part of the reason why that matters is that in both of the parties, the election of the leader is not solely a parliamentary event, but the triggering of a leader's downfall is. So in the Labour Party, if Keir Starmer is to be removed, it will take 80 MPs to sign up for somebody else. In the Conservative Party, if a leader of the Conservative Party is to be removed, it will take a third of MPs to write to the chairman of the 1922 committee and more than half of MPs to vote to remove them. These are purely internal to Parliament mechanisms. And so using PMQs as a leader to show that actually your leadership has qualities to it that people admire, is going in the right direction, you've got a bit of metal to the way in which you're leading the party, I actually think is maybe the biggest advantage that it has, particularly in tough times for party leaders.
Well, I just want to say that I think Prime Minister's questions is actually of constitutional importance. The British Constitution, as I've said in other episodes, is a political constitution, and that means that the checks in our system are broadly political checks rather than formal legal checks. The British Constitution vests enormous power in the Prime Minister. The Prime Minister, in my view, is constitutionally speaking a more powerful figure in the British system than in almost any other constitutional system, and that includes presidential systems. As Quentin Hogg, Viscount Hailsham, or as Clive James used to call him, Quentin Swine, Lord Hogwash, once said, the British Constitution creates an elective dictatorship. I don't think that's a bad thing because I think it's important for governments to be able to govern. And I think that power used profoundly on behalf of the people is generally to be welcomed. But I do think in that situation where there's profound concentration of power, there also needs to be profound concentration of accountability. And Prime Minister's questions is a form of profound concentration of accountability in the Prime Minister. And it means that every week for half an hour at least, the Prime Minister has to be accountable to his political opponents and to a random selection of MPs in the chamber who can ask the Prime Minister whatever they want, and the Prime Minister has to stand up there and account for his or her actions. And I think people who complain about Prime Minister's questions and say that it's too boisterous, too adversarial, miss a crucial point, that it's actually the adversarial nature of our House of Commons that is one of those political checks in our Constitution, and that if they remove that by making the House of Commons more sedate, more fitting with the modern human resources outlook that sadly defines much of the public and indeed private sector today, then you are actually taking away a tool for the representatives of our people to hold our political masters to account. And I think that's a bad thing.
The scrutiny of Prime Minister's questions, I think, is certainly important. I mean, you've spoken recently on the main podcast, Richard, about when you were reading the book Original Sin about the Biden administration and about attempts to try and disguise, I think, pull the wool over the eyes of the American public about the mental faculties of Joe Biden whilst he was in the White House. Now, I think that was possible because you can cocoon an American president away from much scrutiny. They they do the State of the Union, and all of their own side will jump up on their feet all the time, and the words are written out in front of them. They will only do media appearances with sympathetic interviewers. Prime Minister's questions is a wholly different beast. I genuinely do not think that if you had a British Prime Minister who was going through the very sad challenges that Joe Biden went through as president around his own mental abilities and memory and all the rest of it, I do not think they would be able to withstand the pressure and the scrutiny of Prime Minister's questions. I think what the American public eventually found out when there was that debate in June of 2024 against Donald Trump would be found out by members of parliament and journalists and the public on any Wednesday in the months and years leading up to that, because you would not be able to cope with PMQs. And in that sense, it is a test of ability as well for our prime ministers, which I don't think is a bad one at all.
I think that's absolutely right, Lee. It's one of those things that I've always puzzled about when it comes to discussions at British general elections about whether there should be a prime ministerial debate. And I can remember in 2010, which was the first election I voted in, there was all this drama over the fact that there were going to be these prime ministerial debates. And people got very excited about it. And I remember watching it with some of my friends at university. But I did think to myself, why is everyone so anticipatory about this debate when every week Gordon Brown, David Cameron, and Nick Clegg square off against each other in the House of Commons. It's not like we've not seen Gordon Brown subjected to direct questioning by his political opponents in a very confrontational, adversarial context. And indeed, when I watched the Prime Minister's debates in 2010, I thought this is a pale imitation of PMQs. There is, in my view, far less pressure that's being put on the political leaders in this quite sanitized debate format compared to the debate format of the House of Commons that these men have had to deal with for years now. And I think it does speak to some of this kind of infection of American political culture, where there is genuine drama and anticipation in a presidential debate, but that's because the president lacks that kind of scrutiny that a prime minister faces in a week by week basis under the British parliamentary system. And so I think you're absolutely right, Lee. It's based on what I was reading in the Jake Tapper and Andrew Sullivan book, Original Sin, and also in the book about the 2024 election fight. It's unimaginable to think that Joe Biden would have been able to sustain half an hour every week being pummeled by opposition candidates in that format. He might have done okay in some of them because he did have a bit of fight in him. But generally speaking, I think that would have exposed some of his mental decline much more rapidly. And I might also add the same may be true for the current incumbent in the White House, who is rapidly approaching his 80s.
We're going to finish by looking at the public's view and ideas for change. But before that, there's one leadership in particular that I think Prime Minister's Questions does not work for at the moment. And you see it with the complaints that he makes, and also the fact that roughly around half the time at the moment, he seems not to go into the chamber for Prime Minister's Questions, but to sit up in the gallery. And that is, of course, the complaint of Nigel Farage, that he does not get guaranteed questions to the Prime Minister. That does open up a little bit of a problem, I think, arguably for Prime Minister's Questions in the context of highly volatile politics. Of course, the structure of Prime Minister's Questions, most obviously who the Prime Minister is, who the leader of the opposition is, who the leader of the third largest party is a product of the seat allocation in Parliament, which is overwhelmingly down to the last general election and tweaked over time by by-election results and defections and so on. But what that means, basically, is that because Reform only won 5 seats at the last election, and because, in spite of defections, they only have 8 MPs at the moment, Nigel Farage is a very, very long way from being guaranteed questions for Reform to the Prime Minister every week. Even if you had really dramatic changes in the parliamentary makeup with dozens more defections going to Reform UK, something I personally do not think especially likely, Farage would still not be guaranteed questions every week to the Prime Minister and would still not be leader of the third largest party in the House of Commons. So there is this criticism they can make, which is that the debate and the scrutiny as it takes place in the chamber at midday every Wednesday is detached from the political battle as it is actually taking place out in the country, and as it will be in May, or as it is shown in the opinion polls, where Reform are leading in the polls still, in spite of recent declines in their performance. And this can then lead to a slightly odd arrangement in PMQs, where the Prime Minister and quite often Labour MPs will be talking about Reform a lot in their questions, but the voice that you don't hear is Reform's itself.
Yeah, although I would say this is a really exceptional and unusual time in British politics where you see a party that currently has fewer than 10 MPs leading the polls for a year now, and that very small party is talked about as reasonably possibly being the next governing party of the country. I mean, that generally does not happen in British politics, except in these kind of once in a century realignments of the British party system, which admittedly we may or may not be going through. We have and probably will continue to discuss that in future, in past and future episodes. So it is a bit of an anomaly of the situation at the moment, but generally speaking, I don't think it's a bad thing that the smaller parties get fewer questions. I mean, the choice of the questions is fair in the sense that it is a random selection of MPs who enter the ballot for the shuffle. And really, the only institutional advantage is the one that's given to the leader of the opposition, which I think is perfectly fine from a constitutional perspective, because we do have this notion, not just His Majesty's government, but His Majesty's most loyal opposition. And there are perks to being the official opposition, and those aren't to be sniffed at. Just on your point about whether reform could overtake some of the smaller parties to get a status as a third or second party in Parliament, I can remember in 2019 when Change UK was formed, and this was a breakaway of Europhile centrists in Parliament, a combination of Labour and Conservative MPs who were in favour of overturning the democratic result of the 2016 referendum to leave the EU. I have read that apparently John McDonnell, who at the time was Labour's shadow chancellor, was very worried that there would be a flood of Labour MPs who would join Change UK, such that Change UK would become the third or even the second largest party in Parliament, which would then remove Jeremy Corbyn or challenge Jeremy Corbyn's status as the sort of leader of the opposition. And a change at Prime Minister's questions would be a very visible way for that to happen. And this is allegedly one of the reasons why John McDonnell was converted to the cause of having a second referendum before the implementation of the first referendum on the EU. I don't actually think it was a realistic prospect. I think that McDonnell panicked unnecessarily. I've written about that in our book, Keeping the Red Flag Flying, but I have heard that that was one of his considerations.
Okay, so to wrap this midweek episode up, I wanted to look at one of the things that is often said about Prime Minister's questions, which is that the public hate it, that it is an appalling showcase for parliamentary debate and scrutiny. This was a comment you would hear quite often about a decade ago, before the Brexit referendum. Really, for the last decade, we've had bigger fish to fry with the referendum, delivering Brexit, the COVID pandemic, and then the merry-go-round of prime ministers that we've had in quite quick succession. But in the slightly more peaceful period of the coalition government and around 2015, I remember Ed Miliband saying that he doesn't think that PMQs is a great advert for politics and parliament. Nick Clegg labelled it totally off-putting and said, in a phrase that just goes through me, but it's very Nick Clegg, that it needed to look and feel more modern.
Oh, shudder.
But there is some evidence, again, from around about this period of time that the public really do dislike it. So the Hansard Society did a study in 2014 that showed, for example, that 67% of people thought that there was too much party political point scoring instead of answering the question. Keen to get your thoughts, Richard, but I wanted to kick us off with something. I think there's a difference between the stated preferences and the revealed preferences of the public. So the stated preferences of the public, at least a plurality or often a majority of them, is that politics should be more dour, more serious, more focused on policy, and less boo-ha-ha, less shouty across the chamber and all the rest of it. Well, actually, even for the Prime Minister, we have that several times a year now with the Prime Minister's appearances before the Liaison Committee, which is where all of the chairs of the respective select committees get to interrogate the Prime Minister for several hours. Now, that can have its quite contentious moments, undoubtedly. And the one days before Boris Johnson resigned is one of those moments for sure. But it is much more like what people say that they would like to see. Quite detailed policy questions and longer answers where there's not people jeering or cheering on top of them. But which one do people really pay attention to? The Prime Minister's appearances before the Liaison Committee, of which, for example, David Cameron did significantly more than a dozen, are never really remembered by the public. People don't really watch them. They don't really cut through, to use that appalling phrase that we use so much in political commentary. And so I actually think, even though it's fashionable, and it will always be fashionable to say that the nature of Prime Minister's questions is undesirable, I actually think it is part of what draws people in to political debate. And if we had something really sanitized, a white-walled, modern-styled committee room of dull but worthy questions to the Prime Minister, I don't think that would really be a good example of scrutiny at all.
I absolutely agree with you. And I would just add that polling on this can be rather difficult because politicians and politics in general is in low regard by the public. And so I think pretty much any polling question that you ask, which requests the public evaluate their approval of politicians, will come out by saying that they don't like what politicians are doing at the moment, for the most part, which is a sad thing. And I think that there obviously are issues that need to be addressed. But I think it's the wrong response, but it's quite a typical response. Again, I think of this kind of HR mindset that we see in our, I would say, educated class in this country, which is to say, okay, we don't like this format, so we're going to make this a blander and more boring format, and then the public will like it. But actually, I think the public would also complain about political point scoring if the format was in the liaison committee. And actually, what would be even worse is that fewer members of the public would be paying attention, that there would be less pressure put on our political leaders, there would be fewer opportunities for backbench MPs to cut through, break through, and be advocates on behalf of their constituents. I don't see the liaison committee format as a desirable alternative because it's a limited and fixed number of MPs, and the membership of that committee does not fluctuate in the same way that this random ballot, the shuffle, does for Prime Minister's questions. And I'd just say, relating this back to the reason why we've done these two episodes in Prime Minister's Questions, which was our own visit to the House of Commons to watch Prime Minister's Questions at the invitation of Kate Ferguson, the Sun on Sunday political editor, is that the room was absolutely packed. The press gallery was full, the public gallery was full, the House of Commons chamber was full. And I could see across from us where we were in the press gallery looking at the public gallery, there were school groups that were there. There were people of all different ages, I'm sure different backgrounds, different parts of the country. You know, the first time that I went to Prime Minister's Questions in 2011, it was intended to be a 90th birthday surprise for my grandmother, who was very politically interested and engaged. And I think there is there's no other activity in Parliament which excites the passions of the public and which excite the passions of the country quite in the same way that Prime Minister's Questions does. And I think it would be an absolute act of, I'm going to call it constitutional vandalism, to try to radically overhaul that format.
And to end on just a historical note as well, it used to be the case that huge amounts of our political life as a country were confrontational. So we've spoken before on this podcast about the 1966 documentary Hecklers, which looked at the campaigning in that general election campaign and the way in which Harold Wilson, Quintin Hogg, and others would be faced by members of the public shouting abuse at them sometimes, or shouting heckles at them, to which they had to respond. Well, now the campaigning side of politics is much more controlled than it used to be. And our party leaders and our prime ministers don't really have to deal with hecklers in the way that they once did. The only moment where they're really subjected to braying scrutiny, which, yes, may not be as thoughtful and reflective or cerebral as some people may like, but which is undeniably a political test, is in the House of Commons. And I think we should cling on to it as one of the vitally important bits of our political heritage in this country.
If I can just add one little coda to that, which is that when we were students in Cambridge, our MP was a man called Julian Huppert, or Dr. Julian Huppert, as he insisted on being called by the Speaker. And Dr. Huppert was, in my view, an extremely self-righteous and pompous man. And It wasn't just my view, because every time that he would stand up to ask a question when he was chosen for Prime Minister's Questions, John Bercow, the speaker, would go, "Dr. Julian Huppert," and there would be a groan from MPs as he stood up to say his next sanctimonious question. And Huppert then complained to the press about how this was bullying and how this was not becoming of Parliament and how he didn't like the atmosphere of Prime Minister's Questions. And I wrote a letter into the Cambridge News defending MPs against Julian Huppert, saying that Julian Huppert needed to be taken down a peg or two because he was sanctimonious, he was pompous, and it was quite good that in our political system we have a format where MPs can punctuate that pomposity in a way in which other political systems, MPs get away with just treating themselves all as a little bit too, where MPs just take themselves, I would say, a little bit too seriously.
Well, that's all for this midweek episode of Since Attlee and Churchill. Just a reminder that if you enjoy listening to the podcast, we'd be delighted if you left us a positive review wherever you get your podcasts from, that you can hear bonus episodes and also enjoy the podcast ad-free by joining our new Patreon. But if we don't see you there, we'll be back on Sunday with our next episode, in which we'll be looking at the very first Labour government. We'll see you then.
Thanks very much.